July 17, 1967. Joe Wilcox stood at 17,900 feet on Denali, staring up at the camp where 7 of his teammates waited. The 24-year-old expedition leader faced a brutal choice. A storm was building. His own body was failing from altitude sickness. Below him, safety. Above him, 7 young men who trusted him to bring them home. Wilcox chose descent. Within hours, one of the most violent storms in Denali's history would trap those 7 climbers in the death zone. None would survive. The question that haunts mountaineering to this day: was this abandonment or sound judgment? The brutal arithmetic suggests both answers are wrong. Joe Wilcox had made 50 ascents by age 24, but 0 high-altitude expeditions as leader. Yet, in 1966, cutting Sitka spruces in southeastern Alaska, Denali called to him. The mountain that had killed more climbers than any peak in North America became his obsession. Back at Brigham Young University, recruitment proved nearly impossible. Experienced climbers declined one after another. Wilcox suspected his abrasive personality was the problem. By November 1966, only 2 had joined: Jerry Clark and Mark McLaughlin. Clark, with 14 years of mountaineering experience, took over recruitment. Most team members would barely know their actual leader. The forced merger came from desperation. Howard Snyder's Colorado team lost a member when Steve Lewis broke his arm and nose hours before departure. Park regulations required 4 climbers minimum for Denali attempts. Snyder faced a choice: combine with Wilcox or abandon 2 years of planning and expense. The first meeting was Arctic. Wilcox remained in his car while sizing up Snyder, who felt surveyed like a customer by a Hong Kong tailor. Paul Schlichter described the exchange as frosty. 2 alpha personalities now shared leadership of 12 young men, most strangers to each other. Steve Taylor opposed the merger vehemently. His arguments against combining groups struck Snyder as inane, revealing an apparent lack of basic mountaineering knowledge. Wilcox tried glossing over conflicts, but the psychological fractures were already forming. The brutal arithmetic of inexperience was staggering. Most had never climbed above 14,500 feet. Dennis Luchterhand, 6'4" and studying geology, quietly told Wilcox during training that he was leaving the expedition. Something felt wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong on the mountain. Wilcox convinced him to reconsider, attributing the premonition to altitude effects during their Mount Rainier training. The warning signs were multiplying, but the expedition pressed forward. Equipment disputes emerged immediately. John Russell, the enigmatic 23-year-old who had worked as everything from taxi driver to lumberjack, insisted they were carrying too much gear. He demanded they abandon saws and shovels in favor of lighter packs. Clark and McLaughlin opposed this strenuously, understanding these tools were essential for building snow shelters during storms. Russell's rebellion succeeded. The expedition left behind the very equipment that might have saved lives weeks later. The personality conflicts intensified at altitude. Walt Taylor, the quick-witted medical student from Indiana, emerged as the group's most mature voice. Jerry Clark brought Antarctic expedition experience but clashed with Russell over skiing techniques for equipment transport. Anshel Schiff, the engineering professor, secretly consumed dozens of antacid tablets daily, hiding severe heartburn that would compromise his performance. Mark McLaughlin, known for finding humor in any situation, had conquered 17 peaks in Washington and Oregon. His tent-making skills and equipment knowledge made him invaluable, but even his optimism couldn't bridge the growing divisions. The leadership vacuum was becoming apparent. Wilcox avoided confrontation, hoping conflicts would resolve naturally. His soft management style, unusual for mountaineering expeditions, enabled dangerous group dynamics. Modern expeditions grant guides absolute authority over client safety decisions. In 1967, expedition culture was more democratic and far more deadly. By the time 12 young men reached Wonder Lake at Denali's base, the psychological architecture of disaster was complete. Personality conflicts, equipment shortages, inexperience, and leadership failure had created a perfect storm of human factors. The mountain would simply provide the final trigger. The team was broken, but the weather window was open. Which of the 12 men would be forced to make the ultimate, life-saving choice to turn back? Steve Taylor was already showing altitude sickness symptoms at just 2,300 feet. Howard Snyder described his demeanor as that of a man in continual depression, terrified by the sight of the mountain. The fear was literally making him sick before they even reached the glacier. The expedition that would become America's deadliest mountaineering disaster was fracturing before it truly began. The first 5 days brought damp weather and escalating tensions. Walt Taylor kept shouting at the gray skies, pleading for the sun to appear. He even suggested the team walk around naked to showcase their belief in the sun god. Nobody accepted the offer. Steve Taylor's condition deteriorated rapidly. Already sick at Wonder Lake, he struggled with basic tasks as they established camps along the Muldrow Glacier route. The psychological pressure was breaking him down faster than the altitude. Howard Snyder watched Taylor's demeanor darken into what he described as continual depression. Paul Schlichter agreed that Taylor psychologically wasn't ready for the expedition and questioned why he was even there. The false security of Denali's long daylight hours masked critical timing failures. In July, the sun sets at midnight and rises at 4 a.m. This lulled inexperienced climbers into believing they had unlimited time for summit attempts. Traditional mountaineering wisdom demands alpine starts before dawn to avoid afternoon weather deterioration. The extended daylight created dangerous complacency about departure times. Camp by camp, the deterioration accelerated. On-shell shifts, hidden heartburn worsened, forcing him to secretly consume 12 antacid tablets daily. The medication masked a growing problem that would eventually force his evacuation. His inability to eat before or during strenuous activity meant he was slowly starving at altitude. Mounting exhaustion affected decision-making. The brutal arithmetic of high-altitude physiology was asserting itself. Above 14,000 feet, the human body begins consuming itself for energy. Sleep becomes fragmented. Appetite disappears. Judgment deteriorates. These 12 young men were entering an environment where their brains would literally start dying from oxygen starvation. Between camps 2 and 3, avalanche danger forced several days of rest. The men enjoyed snowball fights and chess games. Luchterhand lamented the lack of women on the expedition. Janes read books aloud. Conversations turned to the Vietnam War. The camaraderie was real, but so were the underlying fractures. By early July, when they established Camp 3, conflicts multiplied. Russell accused Schiff of carrying smaller loads than required. Walt Taylor tried mediating, addressing Schiff directly about his lighter loads and offering team assistance if needed. The altitude was becoming the great equalizer, treating both strong and weak with the same contempt. Headaches and vomiting marked the obvious cases of altitude sickness. Less obvious symptoms were more dangerous: insomnia, dehydration, lack of appetite, and swollen extremities. The human body was systematically shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core organs. Camp 4 was established on July 4th, Independence Day. The irony would prove bitter. As they climbed faster to make up time, fatigue began influencing critical decisions. The team's democratic decision-making process, already problematic at sea level, became potentially lethal as oxygen-starved brains struggled with complex choices. The psychological pressure was mounting alongside the physical stress. 12 young men, most strangers to each other, were being compressed into an environment that strips away social niceties and reveals core character. The personality conflicts that seemed manageable at base camp were becoming existential threats. The mountain itself was rewriting their expedition rules in real time. Equipment they thought unnecessary became essential. Timeline buffers they considered excessive proved inadequate. Leadership styles that worked in college mountaineering clubs failed catastrophically in the death zone. By the time they reached Camp 6 at 15,100 feet, the expedition had already fractured into competing factions. The summit was still 5,000 vertical feet above them, but the real enemy was no longer the mountain. It was the psychological and logistical breakdown happening within their own ranks. July 13th brought the critical decision point. After lunch, Joe Wilcox gathered several team members in the cook tent to discuss summit strategy. Weather forecasts from Eelson Visitor Center showed ideal conditions for the next 2 days. Wilcox announced they should make a run for the summit, with everyone packing 5 days of food to 18,000 feet and climbing to the summit the following day. The discussion revealed deeper fractures. They decided to establish another camp at 16,500 feet for additional acclimatization, splitting the team again. The Taylor brothers, Schiff and Russell, would remain at Camp 6 to pack 6 days of food for 10 people. 8 others would climb to 17,900 feet with 4 days of supplies and attempt the summit on July 15th. The remainder would try Sunday, July 16th. The Colorado climbers ate separately and were not included in the planning meeting. When Wilcox passed the plan over their tent wall, they agreed without enthusiasm. The expedition was operating as 2 separate teams, sharing the same mountain. July 15th arrived with deceptive clarity. Only 4 men were ready at the appointed departure hour: Wilcox and the 3 Colorado climbers. The rest refused to go, citing fatigue and illness. The strange makeup was practically accidental. When Wilcox emerged from his tent before the summit attempt, only Snyder, Schlichter, and Lewis stood prepared. The weather window psychology proved deadly. After 27 days on the mountain, Wilcox understood that good conditions could vanish as quickly as they appeared. But the team's inexperience showed in their inability to capitalize on the opportunity. The most experienced climbers, Schlichter and Snyder, had met in 1963 and conquered peaks in Colorado and Mexico together. Their preparation was decisive. The other members had never climbed above 14,500 feet before Denali. At 6:30 p.m., with the summit visible, Wilcox radioed the Rangers. The recording captures his quick, short breaths as he asked about the distance to the summit. Minutes of labored breathing followed before the Ranger inquired if they were on the summit. Wilcox confirmed that all 4 of them had made it. Howard Snyder described the view as beautiful, with Foraker clear of clouds and peaks to the southeast, visible through the low-lying valley clouds. The summit team spent 90 minutes on top, taking pictures, dictating postcards over radio, lighting firecrackers, drinking Coke that Joe had saved for the moment. Above them stretched blue sky and brilliant sunshine. Nothing indicated the meteorological juggernaut bearing down on the mountain. Joe Wilcox had secured his own life, but as he descended, he left 7 men behind. What was the final, desperate message the doomed climbers sent from the summit, and why did it become the last word anyone ever heard from them? The counterclockwise spinning low-pressure system approached from the north with warm, moisture-laden winds. The high-pressure system remained parked over the Alaska Range, its cold, dry air. Air rotating in the opposite direction. Soon they would touch, rotating like cogs in a great weather machine, generating winds at the summit beyond imagination. By the time the summit team reached Denali Pass during the descent, cirrus clouds had covered the sun and winds were strengthening. Meanwhile, the remaining 8 team members prepared for their own summit attempt, planning to depart the next day. They tried ignoring the clouds brewing overhead, a sure sign of an impending storm. Snow was already beginning to fall. July 16th brought strong winds that forced the second group to postpone their summit attempt. They waited in their tents as the weather deteriorated. July 17th morning seemed calm. The 4 summit conquerors decided to separate again and begin descent to Camp 6. They saw no point spending more time at such altitude. Fewer people in the upper camp meant more food and fuel for those remaining. Jerry Lewis's condition was deteriorating, making descent the priority. Mountain sickness was also undermining John Russell, who vomited whenever he tried eating. Joe Wilcox appeared to be suffering severely from altitude effects. Both Snyder and Schlichter recalled him looking terrible. Snyder later recalled that Wilcox was so sick before they came down that he could not pack his own equipment, and his teammates had to do it for him. Wilcox wanted to stay and support the second summit team, but Clark convinced him to descend. The psychological moment of abandonment came at 1 p.m. Snyder, Schlichter, Lewis, Schiff, and Wilcox started their descent, occasionally glancing back at the camp where 8 teammates remained. Time passed. They continued descending. The other group still had not roped up to begin their route. At 3 p.m., the 5 descending climbers reached Camp 6. Above them, the summit assault had finally begun. Walt Taylor was laying the route across Harper Glacier to Denali Pass. Reaching 3 p.m. was dangerously late. For starting an ascent, in ideal conditions, the summit required 6 hours, with at least 2 more for the return. The extended daylight had masked this critical timing failure. As the successful summit team moved further from their teammates, they could not imagine this was the last time they would see their friends alive. Jerry Clark led the second summit team into what would become a meteorological nightmare. The 23-year-old Steve Taylor remained at camp, too sick from altitude to move. 6 men roped together for the final push: Clark, McLaughlin, Luchterhand, Janes, Walt Taylor, and Russell. 5 hours after departure, at 8:30 p.m., Clark radioed park rangers from somewhere high on the mountain. Thick fog had blocked their path. He could not determine their exact location. The group decided to wait out the night at the peak, hoping weather would improve. They had little food, minimal water, and only a few sleeping bags. The plan had been to climb fast and descend quickly. At 11:30 a.m. on July 18th, Clark contacted rangers again. His group had reached the summit. Wind howled into the microphone as he reported only 5 people made it to the peak. John Russell had turned back before the summit. Then Mark McLaughlin took the radio. McLaughlin asked Ranger Haber about sending postcards from the summit, then dictated a message to his parents saying he was okay and would see them in a week or 2. When asked to describe the view, McLaughlin's response was chilling. The view consisted he could see only his 4 teammates. Everything was completely whited out. He promised to contact them again at 8 p.m. That call never came. One of the most severe whiteouts in Denali's history descended upon the mountain. The wind howled, the radio went silent, and the clock started ticking on the most horrifying 5-day wait in Denali's history. We will break down the brutal science of how the mountain slowly killed them. The storm trapped both groups. Wilcox, Schiff, Snyder, Schleichter, and Lewis huddled at 15,100 feet, pent up in their tents, awaiting the scheduled 8 p.m. radio contact. When their friends did not call back, no one was especially worried. After the grueling summit climb, who would blame them for collapsing into their tents without bothering to radio? Late that evening, Schiff interrupted his conversation with Wilcox inside their swaying tent. He said he heard voices. Wilcox poked his head into the driving snow, but the sound was gone. Joe wanted to return to the upper camp immediately, but Snyder dissuaded him, suggesting they wait for calmer weather. The brutal mathematics of hypothermia were already beginning. Stage 1 drops core body temperature 1 to 2 degrees Celsius below normal, slight trembling begins, complex hand tasks become impossible as extremities go numb, blood vessels constrict, focusing resources on vital organs. Stage 2 brings temperature drops of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. Trembling intensifies, muscle coordination becomes noticeably impaired, movements turn slow and labored. The person may appear alert, but confusion sets in. Lips and ears begin to lose feeling. Stage 3 arrives when body temperature drops to 32 degrees Celsius. Shaking usually stops, speaking becomes difficult, cellular metabolic processes halt. Below 30 degrees, exposed skin becomes blue and swollen. Heart and respiration rates drop severely. Major organs begin failing, eventually resulting in death. 5-day whiteout sealed the fate of those trapped in the death zone. Rescue teams. When rescue teams finally reached the high camps, they found 3 frozen bodies. One sat upright beside a makeshift shelter, holding a tent pole to the end. The remaining 4 were consumed by the mountain, never recovered despite extensive searches. Brad Washburn. Years later, Brad Washburn approached Joe Wilcox at a mountaineering symposium. The same man who had ridiculed the young expedition leader's plans told him that under the circumstances, he had done everything in his power to deal with that horrific event. The National Weather Service concluded that even modern technology could not have saved them from that storm. The real executioner was not leadership failure, but the unforgiving limits of high altitude combined with the longest, most violent storm in Denali's recorded history. Subscribe for more forensic breakdowns of mountaineering's deadliest decisions.